They wrote it down, they signed it, they sent it to the President of the United States, and they expected him to say yes. The document is 13 pages long. It is dated March 13, 1962. It carries the reference number JCS 202-62-1, which means it was generated inside the office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest uniformed military authority in the country. It was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the title at the top of the first page reads, in flat bureaucratic English, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. My name is Blackwell. I have spent 2 decades reading documents that governments tried very hard to lose. I have sat in the reading rooms of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, with white cotton gloves on, turning pages that were stamped top secret in red ink for 35 years before someone finally ran a pen through the stamp and wrote underneath, Declassified. I'm going to tell you about 6 of those documents tonight. 6 lies the United States government told its own citizens, denied for decades, and then was forced to admit. None of these stories require speculation. None of them require theories. Every single one is on file. Every single one is now public. The only thing that ever connected them was the small, stubborn fact that one person in each case refused to stay quiet. We start in 1962. We start with a man named Lyman Lemnitzer. Lemnitzer was 62 years old in the spring of 1962. He had served in the Army since 1920. He had fought in North Africa under Eisenhower. He had been wounded in Sicily. He had helped negotiate the Italian surrender in 1943. He was, by every conventional measure, a serious soldier with a serious career. And in October of 1960, he had been promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He sat in the Pentagon. He answered to the president. He outranked every uniformed officer in the United States military. The problem on his desk in the spring of 1962 was Cuba. Fidel Castro had taken power in January of 1959. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961 had been a catastrophic failure. 1,400 Cuban exiles had been put on the beach with American support, abandoned and either killed or captured. The Kennedy administration was humiliated. The Joint Chiefs blamed Kennedy for refusing to provide air cover. Kennedy blamed the chiefs for assuring him the operation would succeed without it. The relationship was poisoned. And inside the Pentagon, the conviction was hardening that Castro had to be removed by direct American military action, and that the only thing missing was a reason. That is the context for the document Lemnitzer signed on March 13th. The document was not written by Lemnitzer alone. It was the product of an inter-service working group called the Caribbean Survey Group, which had been operating inside the Joint Chiefs since the previous summer. The working group was tasked with one question: how do we manufacture a justification for invading Cuba that the American public will accept? The answer they produced, and which Lemnitzer signed off on, is one of the most extraordinary documents ever to leave the Pentagon. The plan had a name: Operation Northwoods. It proposed, in calm, typewritten paragraphs, that the United States government conduct a series of fabricated attacks against American citizens, American military installations, and American property, and then blame those attacks on Cuba. Specifically, the document recommended sinking a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay and faking the funerals for the dead sailors. It recommended staging the apparent shooting down of a civilian airliner full of college students by substituting an unmanned drone for the real plane, while the actual passengers were quietly diverted to a CIA airfield. It recommended bombing a U.S. Navy ship and blaming the explosion on Cuban forces. It recommended a campaign of staged terror in Miami, Washington, and other U.S. cities, with the bombings and the casualties to be reported as Cuban-sponsored. It recommended faking a Cuban Air Force attack on a neighboring Caribbean country. It recommended manufacturing fake Cuban evidence, fake Cuban radio transmissions, fake Cuban weapons, and even producing what the document called a Remember the Maine incident, referring to the explosion that started the Spanish-American War in 1898. an explosion which most historians by 1962 already believed had been an accident misrepresented as an attack. The phrase that appears in the document, the phrase that catches the eye of anyone who reads the original, is this: "We could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in US newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation." A helpful wave of national indignation. That is the language of the Pentagon in 1962, planning the deliberate murder of American citizens for political effect. The document was hand-carried to the office of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara read it. McNamara handed it to President John F. Kennedy. And here, at this single point, the entire history of the next 60 years bent in a different direction. Because Kennedy said no. He said no in person. He said no in writing. He removed Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs in October of that same year, although the official explanation given was that Lemnitzer's term had simply ended. Lemnitzer was reassigned to Europe, where he was made Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He was not punished. He was not investigated. He was not even publicly identified as the man who had signed the Northwoods Plan. He simply disappeared into a 4-star command in Brussels and stayed there until he retired in 1969. The document went into a safe in the Pentagon. It was classified at the highest levels, and for 35 years, almost no one outside a very small circle of military and intelligence officials knew it existed. The reason you know about it now is a man named James Bamford. Bamford is an investigative journalist who specializes in the United States intelligence community. In the late 1990s, while researching a book about the National Security Agency, Bamford filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests with the National Security Archive at George Washington University. The archive is a private nonprofit that pursues the systematic declassification of historical government documents. In November of 1997, the archive succeeded in forcing the release of the Northwoods document, along with a large batch of Joint Chiefs files from the Cuba period. Bamford published the document in his book, Body of Secrets, which appeared in 2001. The day the book came out, mainstream historians who had spent their careers studying Kennedy and Cuba had to sit down and reread their own work. Because here, in their hands, was the proof that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States of America in 1962 had formally proposed to murder American civilians as a pretext for war. The Pentagon, when asked, did not deny the document. The Pentagon could not deny the document because the Pentagon was the agency that had released it. What the Pentagon said, in carefully prepared statements, was that the document represented the views of a working group, not formal policy, and that the president had rejected it, and that no actions described in the document had ever been carried out. All of which was true, and none of which addressed the question that lingered after every close reading. Who, exactly, were these officers, and what other documents like this one might still be sitting in safes that no one has yet been forced to open? I have a copy of the original document in my files. The paper is yellowed now. The typeface is the slightly uneven courier of an early 1960s electric typewriter. The signature at the bottom is in dark blue ink, a confident loop. L.L. Lemnitzer. There is nothing in the appearance of the document that suggests madness or extremism. It looks like every other staff paper from that era. It looks like a routine piece of military planning. That is what is most disturbing about it. Not the content, although the content is grotesque. The bureaucratic normality, the carbon copies, the distribution list, the fact that 13 pages outlining the murder of American citizens were typed up, signed, photocopied, filed, and treated by everyone involved as a normal piece of office paperwork. Lemnitzer died in November of 1988. He was 89 years old. His obituary in the New York Times described him as a distinguished soldier and Cold War commander. The word Northwoods did not appear. It would not appear in any mainstream account of his life for another 9 years. until Bamford pulled the document out of the archive and put it in front of the public. By then, Lemnitzer had been in the ground for almost a decade. He was never asked a single question about it. That is the first portrait. Hold it in your mind. We are going to add 5 more. On the night of March 8, 1971, Muhammad Ali fought Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was billed as the fight of the century. 800 million people watched it on closed-circuit television around the world. The streets of every American city emptied out. Police precincts switched to skeleton staffing. FBI field offices ran a single-duty agent, and in the small Pennsylvania town of Media, 20 miles outside Philadelphia, 8 people in dark clothing walked through an unlocked side door of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's resident agency, picked the locks on the filing cabinets, and stole more than 1,000 pages of internal documents. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. There were 8 of them: a physics professor named William Davidon, a married couple, John and Bonnie Raines, who left their 3 young children with friends for the night, a graduate student named Bob Williamson, a social worker named Keith Forsyth, who had spent 6 months learning to pick locks, a daycare director named Judy Feingold, a taxi driver named Susan Smith, and a labor organizer whose identity remained protected for decades. None of them were professional criminals. None of them had ever broken into a building before. They believed, with the absolute conviction of people who had spent the late 1960s watching the FBI infiltrate every civil rights group, every anti-war group, every student movement they had ever joined, that the Bureau was running an illegal domestic surveillance program. They had no proof. They went looking for it. What they found, when they spread the stolen files out on the floor of a Pennsylvania farmhouse 3 days later, was the proof. The first document on the top of the pile carried a single word at the top of the page: COINTELPRO. None of them had ever heard the word before. Almost no one in America had. They mailed copies of the documents anonymously to 3 newspapers. 2 of the papers, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, returned the documents unread to the FBI. The 3rd paper, the Washington Post, under the editorial leadership of Ben Bradley, did the opposite. On March 24, 1971, the Post published the first story. Within weeks, the word COINTELPRO was on the front pages of every major newspaper in the country. Within months, Carl Stern, a reporter for NBC News, filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that forced the Justice Department to release the full COINTELPRO files. By 1976, the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, had published a 6-volume report that laid out the entire program in detail. COINTELPRO was the counterintelligence program of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It had been launched in 1956 by Director J. Edgar Hoover, originally as a covert operation against the American Communist Party, and it had expanded over 15 years into a sprawling domestic surveillance and disruption operation against, by the FBI's own internal accounting, more than 2,000 American organizations and individuals. The targets included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, anti-war organizations on hundreds of college campuses, feminist organizations, Catholic peace groups. The targets included Martin Luther King Jr., against whom the FBI conducted an intensive personal harassment campaign that included sending him an anonymous letter in 1964 that suggested he should commit suicide. The targets included actress Jean Seberg, against whom the FBI planted a false story in the press claiming her unborn child had been fathered by a Black Panther leader. Seberg gave birth prematurely to a stillborn daughter. She killed herself in 1979. The FBI's role was acknowledged, in writing, by the Bureau itself in 1979. The methods went far beyond surveillance. The Church Committee documented FBI operations that included sending forged letters between members of targeted groups to provoke factional violence. planting informants who served as agent provocateurs, encouraging illegal acts in order to get group members arrested. Coordinating with local police to arrange arrests on fabricated charges. Coordinating with the Internal Revenue Service to trigger audits of activists. The phrase that appears repeatedly in the internal FBI memoranda in Hoover's own dictated language is the same phrase. The purpose of this program is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of the targets. Neutralize. That is the word. It appears in hundreds of documents. The FBI Director of the United States used the word neutralize in writing to refer to American citizens engaged in lawful political activity. COINTELPRO was officially terminated in 1971 in the immediate aftermath of the media break-in, when Hoover concluded that the program could no longer be kept secret. Hoover died the following year. The Church Committee report led directly to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which created the FISA court and was supposed to prevent the kind of warrantless domestic surveillance that COINTELPRO had relied upon. Whether it succeeded is a separate question for a separate episode. The point here is narrower. The program existed. The program was illegal. The program targeted Americans who had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional right to political speech. And the only reason the public ever learned about it was because 8 ordinary people on a fight night in 1971 decided to break into a federal office. The 8 burglars were never caught. The FBI investigated the case for 5 years and closed the file in 1976 without making a single arrest. The statute of limitations expired in 1976. In 2014, journalist Betty Metzger, who had been the original Washington Post reporter on the story, published a book identifying most of the burglars by name, with their consent. They came forward, finally, in their 70s. The citizens caught the FBI. The FBI never found the citizens. In April of 1963, a destroyer named the USS George Eastman, anchored off the coast of Oahu, was sprayed from above with a fine mist. The mist was released from a Marine Corps aircraft passing low over the deck. The ship's sailors had been told that an exercise was being conducted. They had not been told what the exercise was. They had not been issued protective gear. The mist that settled on their skin and their uniforms and the deck plating around them was a simulant compound designed to mimic the dispersion characteristics of the nerve agent sarin. 212 sailors were on board. 7 months later, in November of 1963, a tugboat called the USS Granville S. Hall sailed into a test area near Johnston Atoll in the Pacific. The Granville S. Hall was carrying instruments to measure the dispersion of a different agent, the nerve compound VX. VX is among the most lethal chemical weapons ever synthesized by the United States military. A drop the size of a pinhead on bare skin can be fatal within minutes. The crew of the Granville S. Hall was, again, not informed of what was being released. They were ordered to remain at their stations. They were ordered, in the words of the operational record, to maintain normal shipboard duties. The program that conducted these tests was called Project SHAD. The acronym stood for Shipboard Hazard and Defense. It was operated by the Deseret Test Center, a U.S. Army facility in Utah, between 1962 and 1974. Over those 12 years, Project SHAD ran approximately 50 distinct operations, exposing the crews of dozens of U.S. Navy ships and the sailors and Marines stationed on islands in the Pacific to a wide range of chemical and biological agents. Some of the agents were simulants. Some of them were the real compounds. The men exposed were never told which was which. Most of them were never told the tests had occurred at all. By the late 1980s, veterans of these tests began to develop unusual clusters of cancers, neurological disorders, and respiratory illnesses. They went to the Department of Veterans Affairs for treatment. The department had no record of their exposure. When the veterans pushed for explanations, they were told the records were classified. When they pushed harder, they were told the records did not exist. Some of them died waiting. The man who finally cracked Project SHAD open was a former Navy hospital corpsman named Jack Alderson. Alderson had served on one of the test ships. He had spent more than a decade documenting the illness patterns among his shipmates. He had gathered names, dates, medical records, autopsy reports. He had filed Freedom of Information Act requests that came back redacted to the point of meaninglessness. In 1996, Alderson testified before a Senate committee. His testimony, combined with reporting by journalists at the Hartford Courant and pressure from Senator J. Rockefeller of West Virginia, eventually forced the Department of Defense to acknowledge what it had done. In May of 2002, the Pentagon issued the first of what became a series of fact sheets. The fact sheets confirmed that Project SHAD had taken place. They listed the ships involved. They listed the agents used. They confirmed that the crews had not been informed. The Pentagon's official position was that the agents released had been of low toxicity and unlikely to cause long-term health effects. The veterans' physicians disagreed. The Government Accountability Office, in a report issued in February of 2004, found that the Pentagon's data was incomplete and that the agency had been unable to confirm or deny whether SHAD veterans had higher rates of illness than other Vietnam-era veterans. 5,842 American servicemen are officially identified as having been exposed during Project SHAD. The actual number is almost certainly higher because the Pentagon has acknowledged that the records of several operations have been lost or destroyed. The Department of Veterans Affairs eventually established limited eligibility for SHAD veterans to receive disability benefits. The application process is complex. The approval rate is low. The Pentagon admitted what it had done. The compensation has, in most cases, never arrived. Peter Buxton wrote a letter. The Centers for Disease Control read it, and they decided to keep going. Buxton was 28 years old in 1966. He worked for the United States Public Health Service in San Francisco as an investigator of sexually transmitted infections. He was, by the account of everyone who knew him, an unremarkable young man in a remarkable bureaucracy. In the course of his ordinary work, he came across a reference to a long-running medical study being conducted in Macon County, Alabama, by the United States Public Health Service in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute. The study was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. It had begun in 1932. By 1966, it had been running for 34 years. The premise of the study was simple. 600 black men in Macon County had been recruited in 1932. 399 of them had latent syphilis. The other 201 were a control group. The men were told they were being treated for what local doctors called bad blood. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not ever treated for syphilis. The study's design called for the men to be observed, untreated, until they died, at which point their bodies would be autopsied to document the long-term effects of the disease on the human body. The men received free medical examinations, free meals on examination days, and a $50 burial stipend paid to their families upon their death. In 1947, penicillin became the standard, effective, and inexpensive cure for syphilis. The Tuskegee study did not stop. The men were not given penicillin. When some of them, in the course of seeking treatment elsewhere, came close to receiving penicillin from other doctors, the Public Health Service contacted those doctors and instructed them to withhold treatment in order to preserve the integrity of the study. Local draft boards were given lists of study subjects, and those subjects were exempted from military service because military physicals would have detected and treated the disease. The men were monitored. They were tracked. They were prevented from receiving the cure that existed and was sitting in pharmacies a few miles from their homes. Peter Buxton read the protocol in 1966. He could not believe what he was reading. He wrote a letter to the leadership of the Public Health Service, raising what he called moral concerns about the study. The leadership of the Public Health Service convened a panel to consider the question. The panel met in 1969. It considered Buxton's letter. It considered the study. And it voted, formally, to continue the study to its conclusion. The minutes of that meeting are now public. The justification given was scientific value. The cost in human lives was not addressed. Buxton did not stop. He wrote more letters. He raised the issue in conversations with colleagues. He tried, for 6 years, to make the system look at what it was doing. The system continued to refuse. In 1972, frustrated past the point of further patience, Buxton took the documents he had to a friend who worked at the Associated Press. The friend put him in touch with a reporter named Gene Heller. Heller verified the documents over the course of several weeks. On July 25, 1972, the Washington Star published Heller's story. The next morning, it was on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. The reaction was immediate and total. Within weeks, the study was halted. Within months, Congress had passed the National Research Act, which established the modern system of institutional review boards, required to oversee any research involving human subjects in the United States. A class action lawsuit on behalf of the survivors and their families was settled in 1974 for $10 million, which, divided among the participants and their heirs, came to amounts in the low thousands of dollars per person. President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government on May 16, 1997. By the time he did, only 8 of the original 399 men with syphilis were still alive to hear it. Most had died of complications from the disease that had been curable for a quarter of a century. The Tuskegee study lasted 40 years. It was conducted in the open. It was published in medical journals. Doctors visiting from other institutions were given tours. The men involved were neighbors, churchgoers, husbands and fathers in a small Alabama county. None of it was secret in any meaningful sense. It was simply unexamined by anyone with the power to stop it, until one 28-year-old federal employee named Peter Buxton decided he could not look away. They thought they had burned every page. They had missed 7 boxes. On the morning of November 28, 1953, an Army biochemist named Frank Olson fell to his death from the window of room 1028 at the Hotel Statler in Manhattan. Olson was 43 years old. He worked at the Special Operations Division of Fort Detrick in Maryland, the United States Army's biological warfare research facility. He had a wife and 3 children at home in Frederick, Maryland. He left no note. The death was ruled a suicide. The official explanation given to the family at the time was that Frank Olson had jumped from the window because he had become depressed. The family was told he had been acting strangely for several days. They were told that he had been on a work trip, that something had happened on the trip, that he had become unwell, and that he had taken his own life. The body was returned to them in a closed casket. They were instructed not to open it. They were told the injuries from the fall made view the number. They learned all of this 22 years later, in June of 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission report on CIA activities within the United States was published, and a single paragraph in that report referring to an unnamed Army scientist who had died in 1953 after being secretly dosed with LSD was recognized by Frank Olson's son Eric as a description of his father. MK-Ultra was the umbrella name for a research program operated by the CIA's Technical Services staff between 1953 and 1973. Its formal purpose was the development of techniques for the chemical and psychological control of human behavior. Its targets included the use of LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and a wide range of other interventions. The program's funding was distributed across more than 80 institutions, including major American universities, hospitals, and prisons. The number of formal sub-projects has been documented at 149. The number of human subjects exposed to MK-Ultra experiments without their informed consent is not known and will never be known because in 1973, on the direct order of CIA Director Richard Helms, the operational records of the program were destroyed. The destruction order was given in January of 1973, in the closing weeks of Helms's tenure as director, as the political environment in Washington was beginning to turn against the agency. The order specified that all MK-Ultra files were to be eliminated. CIA personnel carried out the destruction over the following weeks. They believed, when they were finished, that no documentary record of the program remained. They were wrong by 7 boxes. In 1977, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the journalist John Marks for his book on CIA mind control research, an archivist at the agency searching the Financial Records Office located 7 boxes of MK-Ultra-related material that had been miscategorized as budget files and therefore not destroyed in the 1973 sweep. The boxes contained approximately 20,000 pages. They were the most complete surviving record of the program. They were turned over to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, chaired by Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, which conducted hearings in August of 1977. The hearings produced the formal Senate report on Project MK-Ultra, which remains the principal public document on the program. The Olson family, in 1975, after Eric Olson recognized his father in the Rockefeller report, was invited to the White House. President Gerald Ford apologized to them in person. The CIA paid the family $750,000 in compensation. The family accepted the payment and the apology. They believed in that moment that they finally knew what had happened to Frank Olson. In 1994, Eric Olson hired a forensic pathologist named James Starrs of the George Washington University Law School to exhume his father's body and conduct a second autopsy. Starrs, after examining the remains, reached a conclusion that contradicted the official record on a single specific point. The injuries on Frank Olson's skull were not consistent with a fall from a window. They were consistent with a blow to the head delivered before the fall. Starrs' report concluded that Frank Olson had likely been struck unconscious and then thrown. The Manhattan District Attorney opened a homicide investigation. The investigation reached no conclusion that could be brought to trial. There were no living witnesses. The CIA officers present at the retreat in 1953 were either dead or unwilling to testify. The case remains officially open. Frank Olson did not jump. Frank Olson was, in all likelihood, murdered by the agency he worked for because in the days before his death, he had begun expressing doubts about the program he was part of. And because his colleagues had concluded that a man with doubts and a security clearance was a man who could not safely be allowed to remain alive. None of this was known in 1953. None of this was known in 1975. Some of it is still not known. The 7 boxes saved most of what we know. The rest is buried with the people who burned the other thousands. He photocopied 7,000 pages. He expected to die in prison. Daniel Ellsberg was 40 years old in 1971. He had served as a Marine Company commander in the 1950s. He had earned a doctorate in economics from Harvard. He had worked at the RAND Corporation, the Pentagon's principal civilian research institution. He had served 2 years in Vietnam as a State Department analyst. He had returned to RAND in 1967, where he had been assigned to a small team working on a classified historical study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The study was titled, formally, History of U.S. Decision-Making Process on Vietnam Policy. It ran to 47 volumes and approximately 7,000 pages. It covered American involvement in Vietnam from the end of the Second World War through 1968. It was classified at the highest levels. Fewer than 20 people had clearance to read all of it. Ellsberg was one of them. What Ellsberg read between 1967 and 1969 transformed him. The study documented, in the unguarded internal language of the men who had made the decisions, that 4 successive American presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had systematically misrepresented the war in Vietnam to the American public and to the United States Congress. It documented that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which had been used as the pretext for the escalation of the war in 1964, had been mischaracterized in the official account given to Congress. It documented that the Johnson administration had been planning escalation in 1964, while publicly campaigning on a platform of restraint. It documented that the war's strategists had concluded, internally, by 1966, that the war was unwinnable, and had continued to prosecute it for years afterward, sending tens of thousands of additional Americans to their deaths in order to avoid the political consequences of admitting defeat. Ellsberg, in 1969, made a decision. He decided that the American public had a right to know what was in the study. He spent months, beginning in October of 1969, photocopying the 7,000 pages, working at night at the office of an advertising agency that belonged to a friend. He attempted, first, to pass the documents to members of the United States Senate in the hope that they would be entered into the congressional record under the protection of the Speech and Debate Clause. The senators he approached, including Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, declined. Ellsberg then turned to the press. The first installment was published by the New York Times on June 13, 1971, on the front page under the byline of Neil Sheehan. The headline was, "Vietnam Archive. Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement." The Nixon administration responded within 48 hours, obtaining a federal court injunction against the Times that prevented further publication. Ellsberg, anticipating this, had already provided copies of the documents to the Washington Post, which began publishing on June 18th. The Post was enjoined as well. The case moved through the federal courts at unprecedented speed. Within 15 days of the first publication, it reached the Supreme Court of the United States. Oral arguments were heard on June 26, 1971. The decision was issued 4 days later. On June 30th, the vote was 6-3. The court ruled that the Nixon administration had failed to meet the heavy burden required to justify a prior restraint on the press, and that the New York Times and the Washington Post were free to publish. The decision in New York Times Company versus United States 403 United States 713 remains one of the most important First Amendment rulings in American history. Daniel Ellsberg, in the meantime, had been indicted under the Espionage Act of 1917. He faced 12 charges. The maximum sentence, if he had been convicted on all counts, was 115 years in federal prison. He went to trial in 1973. The trial collapsed in May of that year, after it emerged that the Nixon White House had ordered a covert team, the so-called plumbers, to break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in Beverly Hills in September of 1971 in an attempt to find personal material that could be used to discredit him. The break-in was illegal. The illegal evidence-gathering operation tainted the prosecution. The judge dismissed all charges on May 11, 1973. Ellsberg walked out of the courthouse a free man. What the Pentagon Papers established, beyond any reasonable historical dispute, was that the war in Vietnam had been prosecuted on the basis of systematic public deception by 4 successive American presidential administrations, that the deception had been documented in the internal records of the Department of Defense, and that the men who had ordered the deception had known, in real time, that what they were telling Congress and the American public was false. The papers did not end the war. The war continued for almost 4 more years. But the papers ended a particular kind of unquestioning public faith in the official government narrative of foreign policy, a faith that had survived 2 world wars and the early Cold War. After June of 1971, that faith never fully returned. Whether that change was good or bad for the country is a question Americans are still arguing about. That the change happened, and that one man's photocopier was the cause, is not in dispute. Ellsberg expected to die in prison. He did not. He lived for 52 more years. He died of pancreatic cancer on June 16, 2023, at his home in Kensington, California. He was 92 years old. In the obituaries, he was described as the man who proved that a single citizen, in possession of the truth, and willing to accept the consequences of telling it, could break the silence of an entire government. 6 lies, 6 leaks, 1 pattern. Operation Northwoods sat in a safe for 35 years until James Bamford pulled it out. COINTELPRO ran for 15 years until 8 strangers walked into an FBI office on a fight night. Project SHAD poisoned its own sailors for 12 years until one corpsman refused to let his shipmates be forgotten. The Tuskegee study killed men for 40 years until a 28-year-old federal employee handed the documents to a wire reporter. MKUltra destroyed its own records and would have vanished entirely if not for 7 boxes that had been miscategorized as budget files. The Pentagon Papers exposed 3 decades of presidential lies because one analyst at RAND decided that what he had read was something the public deserved to read too. In every case, the silence broke late. In every case, it broke too late for many of the people who had been harmed. Frank Olson was already in the ground for 22 years before his family learned what had been done to him. The Tuskegee men were mostly dead before the apology came. The SHAD veterans, in many cases, are still waiting for compensation that will probably never arrive in their lifetimes. The harm done by these programs has not been undone. It cannot be undone. The dead do not return because a document is declassified, but the documents are now public, every one of them. They sit in the National Archives, in the National Security Archive at George Washington University, in the reading rooms of university libraries, in PDF files that anyone with an internet connection can download and read tonight. The lies that were once classified at the highest levels of the United States government are now searchable on a phone. That is not a small thing. That is the slow, grinding mechanism of a free society correcting its own record, with a delay measured in decades, but correcting it nonetheless. The pattern the 6 portraits share is not, in the end, a pattern of conspiracy. It is a pattern of leakage. Every large bureaucracy generates more paper than it can destroy. Every secret operation has more participants than it can silence. Every lie has, sitting somewhere in its files, the document that disproves it. The only variable is whether anyone is willing to find that document and carry it out into the light. Lemnitzer signed his name. Hoover dictated his memos. The CIA officers wrote up their MKUltra budgets. The Public Health Service published its Tuskegee data in medical journals for 40 years. The Pentagon historians compiled their 7,000 pages knowing that the men they were writing about were still alive. None of these people believed they were going to be caught. All of them were caught. If you take one thing from these 6 stories, take this. The institutions that lied to you did not get away with it. They were exposed. They were forced to admit what they had done. And in every case, the person who broke the silence was not a senator, not a general, not a famous journalist. It was a Pentagon researcher named Bamford, a physics professor named Davidon, a Navy corpsman named Alderson, a health investigator named Buxton, an archivist whose name has been forgotten, sorting through misfiled boxes in a CIA records office, an analyst named Ellsberg, working alone at night with a photocopier. 6 lies, 6 leaks, 1 pattern, still operating, still grinding, still slowly returning the past to the public record. Silence breaks late, but it always breaks. The next file in this archive concerns a different kind of cover-up, not the secrets that governments hid on purpose, but the accidents they hid because the truth would have been worse. 3 reactors, 3 explosions, 3 official stories that did not survive the documents. We will open that file when we meet again. I am Blackwell. Good night.